So next up, we're going to talk about another way of storing data within Azure, and that is through a proper database. If I go into the marketplace and I go under databases, we can see that there's a number of options that Microsoft is offering to us. Now, the one you might be most familiar with is SQL Server running within Windows. So this is a virtual machine, just as if you had a computer next to you with SQL Server 2017 Enterprise installed. There's many different flavors of SQL Server. You can also bring your own license if you have a SQL Server license and save some money that way. But basically, having SQL Server running in a virtual machine is perhaps the most similar situation you have to SQL Server running in your own environment. So if you're going to do a migration from the SQL Server running in your data center to Microsoft Azure, this would be the simplest approach, right? Just getting it up, getting a SQL Server running in a virtual machine, and then you do the data migration, and you are almost the exact same situation you were before, just running with a different server. Now, that might not be the best approach, and it's certainly not the cheapest approach, but it is perhaps the most familiar to you if that's where you come from. The version that Microsoft wants you to really consider is called Azure SQL Database. Now, Azure SQL Database is a database as a service solution. It basically looks and acts very much like SQL Server. There's a high percentage of compatibility. So if you have a database that's running in SQL Server within your data center, getting that migrated into SQL Database for 95+% of you is going to be basically no trouble at all. You're not using any of the advanced features that SQL Database doesn't support, and so you're just able to migrate your data, point your application to the SQL Database, and move on with your life. Now, SQL Database is a lot cheaper option. There are different pricing options, and we'll go over them in a second. But it actually does save you money compared to a virtual machine and all the costs associated with that. So when you're looking at this from an exam perspective, even from a real life perspective, you really should look at SQL Database as being the best solution for a lot of the situations out there. And really, the only situation that you need a SQL Server in a virtual machine for is something where you're like tuning the settings within a hair of its life, or you're really trying to squeeze out the extra performance on the CPU, and you've got that memory dialed in to just the perfect amount. If you really do need to configure the hardware and the settings to that degree, then you might want to continue on with that. There are also some advanced features with collation and the way that it does full text indexing and things like that that SQL Server, a SQL Database doesn't necessarily support. Now, Microsoft also provides a managed version of this SQL database. So if we go through the SQL database route, you're going to do all the setup, you're going to migrate the data, and you're basically responsible for managing the performance. If the database, if you need more performance out of it, moving to the higher plan. Migrating between plans is super simple, and we're going to look at that as well. But the managed instance basically lets you to migrate the data and let Microsoft take care of the scaling of it, etc. We also have data warehouse for those data warehouse and reporting situations. Data warehouse is designed to support, tons and tons of data, the size of the data. You're going to use something like a data lake to report into a data warehouse. A database pool is part of SQL Database. We'll cover that. Now, besides the SQL Server compatibility version, which is called Azure SQL Database, you'll see that there are 3 other databases that Azure provides that are in the same fashion with Azure SQL Database, but you can have MySQL Database as a service, PostgreSQL as a service, and now I think this is in preview, or perhaps it's available, MariaDB as a service. So if you're relying on any of these database types for your application today, and you want to migrate into Azure, other than having a virtual machine with these softwares installed, I think MySQL is also available as a web app. You can have them as a database as a service, a software as a service type product here. So in this section, we're going to go through setting up Azure SQL Database. We're going to create our first database server and then the database inside of that. And we'll do something similar we've done with Cosmos DB and the tabled storage, in which we're going to start programming a little bit against it to show how compatible it is. The commands for dealing with this are the same ADO.NET that you've been using up till now. So we'll start on with the coding, but it won't be anything that you hopefully haven't seen before in other situations. So in this section, we'll talk about Azure SQL Database as a place to store structured data using relational databases.